Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and again, welcome to this lecture in the series of the Tuohy lectures for this year, sponsored by Walter and Mary Tuohy. Welcome you back on this somewhat dreary night outside. We always expect spring to come in Cleveland. Probably what we'll have is summer next week. Spring just never seems to get here on the right time. For those who have been here on the previous week, I welcome you. Previous weeks, I welcome you back. And for those who are here for the first time, I think you're in for a treat. This has been a very interesting series of lectures on how different religious traditions understand the end times. Dr. Barr has provided us with some fascinating insights and things to think about, and he will continue that tonight and with the final lecture next Tuesday evening. As I've mentioned before, this lecture series is sponsored by the Walter and Mary Tuohy Endowment for Interreligious Studies. They were very generous donors who gave us this money in the 1960s, and this has been one of the earliest chairs in interreligious studies in the United States. Our lecturer, as you may know, is Dr. David Barr, who is a professor of religion at Wright State University, received his PhD from Florida State, taught a number of institutions before he settled at Wright State the last several years. He's widely published in books, articles, deliveries of lectures at scholarly meetings. In other words, he's well prepared for the presentations for this evening. Last week, Dr. Barr talked about the concept of holy war and the ways in which religions have justified war or righteous violence in some manner. Tonight, he will continue this series looking at the concept of the second coming, or parousia, as Christians label it. It is a concept of a figure who returns to earth to assist those who remain on earth. The lecture is entitled The Second Coming, Messiahs, Jesus, and Mahdi. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Barr to the podium.
I've been giving serious thought to changing my subtitle to something like, What Could Possibly Go Wrong? I'm gravely disappointed to have been here 5 weeks and have no one announce the end of the world as a new time to look forward to. I had hoped that use that as my opening, but maybe by next week that will happen. We can use it. Someone was kind enough to share with me a magazine called The End Times, 20th Anniversary Edition. Yeah, if I were doing the End Times, I don't think I'd want to celebrate my 20th anniversary. They also have a 6-year subscription available. So that's something at least. I did a Google search for a new date for the end of the world. The only thing I could come up with was an Islamic site that offered some probabilities. They say that Mahdi will most likely appear in 2013. And Jesus will return in 2022. But that will not be the end of the world. Perhaps they don't want to appear too confident because the Quran says the hour cannot be known. But you put a second coming on the agenda and everybody wants to know when it's going to happen. I guess you wouldn't want to miss it. Nearly half of American Christians agree that the second coming of Jesus is probably going to occur in the next 40 years. And half of them believe it definitely will occur within that period of time. Now, I personally find the idea of the second coming a little odd. It may be too irreverent to ask why the one returning didn't take care of business in the first time and has to come back. But at least we can inquire how the idea of the second coming has developed. There's a precursor to the idea in the traditions of ancient Israel about the return of an ancient prophet who was thought not to have died. You know the story of Elijah swing low, sweet chariot, and he just got on and went to heaven. And so he's available for extra duty, and the one tradition found in Malachi is that he'll come again before the last great day and function as prophet and teacher. But that's not the second coming. It might work for Muslims to think of Jesus as still alive because they don't believe he died. But Christians clearly believe he died. And so how does he come back again? Well, as I think about this, the idea of the second coming seems to rest on two great disappointments. One long before Jesus' time, and one after Jesus' time. In the first instance, the prophet Nathan promised to King David that his sons would rule in perpetuity, that there would never lack a son of David to sit on the throne of Israel. It didn't quite work that way. When the Babylonians conquered Israel in 597, the king became a puppet governor, and with continued unrest, the Babylonians returned, killed all his sons, blinded the king, and carried him off into captivity, where he died. There would never again be a son of David to sit on the throne of Israel. The line of David had come to an end. And that's the first disappointment. How do you deal with that? Many promises were made to the king, and the king was supposed to do many things, including being God's agent for establishing peace and justice on this earth. Those other promises eventually led to the idea that there would be a new king, a new anointed one, a new Messiah, who would come and do the things that were promised in Scripture. Now, there was quite a variety of expectations. The Messiah might be a human king that God raises up. The deliverer might be Michael, who comes and fights the war against evil. It might be a priest or a prophet. And one of the surprising things about the Dead Sea Scrolls is they expected two Messiahs to come, but neither one would get here in time for any of the fighting. They just got here in time for the victory battle, a victory celebration at the end. Could pronounce the grace at the meal and say, everybody, let's eat. So a Messiah, but not a traditional one. Over the years, numerous individuals imagined that they might be such a deliverer, only to disappoint their followers by failing to live up to expectations. And the Gospel of Luke reports that the followers of Jesus experienced a similar disillusionment. In Luke chapter 24, we're told a story of two disciples who were depressed because they had thought, Luke says, that he was the one to redeem Israel. But alas, he was crucified by the Romans. And this is the second disappointment. That is, Jesus did not do what his followers believed he should do as the Messiah. And how do you explain that? The story of how they moved from this disappointment to belief that he would come again is a complicated story. But we can summarize it by saying through a variety of experiences, through some novel interpretations of Scripture, and through some prophetic visions, his followers became convinced that he was still alive. And more, that he would soon return to collect his followers. Our earliest records for this come from a follower of Jesus named Paul, writing about 20 years after Jesus' death. He believed that Jesus would come again in what he called a parousia, meaning a manifestation, an appearance, an arrival, as it were. That he would come with clouds and trumpets and angels and collect his followers. Notice that he does not mention any fighting, any war, any satanic adversaries. This is not the same thing as the traditional picture of the second coming in Christianity. But within the next generation, Jesus' return would be completely enveloped by the myth of the end times that we have been talking about, as we can see clearly in the book of Revelation with its wars to defeat the great dragon, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the great deceiver. And so by a synthesis of messianic traditions, the end time story, the parousia tradition, and the early Christians arrived at the idea of a second coming. One more click and it was supposed to take off. That is, the second coming, as it developed in Christian eschatology, is a combination of ideas that involves the return of Jesus, but deeply embedded in this myth of the end times that we've been talking about for the past several weeks. Now, once invented, the idea of the second coming became a very useful tool, not just for early Christianity, but for Judaism and Islam as well. The second coming is a necessary corollary for any tradition that believes that God has already acted, and yet the world remains as it is. If the agent of judgment is absent, surely he will come back soon. And this is an awkward illustration, but sort of like my mother. When she would observe something wrong amongst her children, she was not a great disciplinarian herself, and she would say, "Just wait till your father gets home." Now, to be clear, this was directed to my brothers. And I'm happy to report that when Dad did get home, she rarely told him what she had seen. So those unimpressed with Jesus' messianic accomplishments were told, just wait till he gets back. But the idea of the second coming is also proven to be a dangerous idea. For claimants have arisen in all three traditions, either asserting that they are the returned Savior or declaring that they know when and where and how he would return. So tonight, what I want to do is briefly review the distinctive features of the end times tradition of each religion, and then look at two examples of those in that tradition who have propounded to be or to be intimately involved with the second coming. But first, perhaps just a little bit of vocabulary. It'll help to explain some of these ideas if you have at least heard these words. And their definitions vary, and these are just a brief definition. Eschatological means anything having to do with the end, from the Greek eschaton, which means end or final. And so it's a general word that can be used rather broadly to talk about any kind of view of the end times. Apocalypticism, by contrast, is a more definite idea of the two ages, this age being under the control of evil powers and the new age about to come. More about that particular view in a minute. Messianism has to do with the agent of transformation, that there will be someone who will function as the one who undoes the present age and brings the new age. Millenarianism means those groups that look for a time of ideal peace on the earth, that the things will be substantially changed. There will be a new age that will be radically different than the present age that we live in. And the parousia is the word that we were using already, Paul's word for the return of Jesus to gather his followers. Unfortunately, scholars use these terms in a variety of ways, and there's significant overlap between them, so that one can rarely be clear about what they actually means. In previous lectures, I have given you this chart, in which I try to account for the three aspects of the end times that I take to be central for understanding the current scenarios of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The first one has to do with the belief in the end times, that they really live in that moment just before the age ends and the new age begins. It is a view of time radically different than any secular view of time that imagines time stretching out before us in some uninterrupted horizon. Secondly, that the total evil of the present age. Now, in both Judaism and Christianity, the evil of the present age is imagined as almost a lesser god. You can find statements that this is the god of this age, that he is the prince of this world. And then the third thing is that there will be some decisive divine act, usually construed as a war, that will bring this new age into being. So these three are the necessary prerequisites and are shared by all three traditions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, to one degree or another, with some variation. In addition, each assumes that their religion will be the final religion, leading to some tension between them. All three share also a basic eschatological framework. Notice how I use that word in there, right? Eschatological. We live in an increasingly evil and increasingly chaotic world. This is part of the proof that the end is near. The apex of this world will be the emergence of a satanic world leader. God will send or resend a savior figure who will defeat evil and establish a just social order, followed by a day of judgment in which everyone will be judged for their deeds and assigned either to bliss or torment. You might think that these end-time events would be, as they are shared by all three traditions, would lead them to respect each other and to collaborate on these sorts of things, but you would be wrong about that. They're simply another way of attacking each other. You might also think that these end-time events would be clear, unmistakable, and impossible to imitate, but you would be wrong about that too. There are numerous instances in each tradition when a second coming proved to be something else altogether. So what happens when true believers take the apocalyptic myth not as only true, but as historically eminent, indeed as happening? Well, it's not a pretty story. So first, the Jewish expectations of the end. Mainstream Jews traditionally draw on the biblical and Talmudic traditions to imagine a messianic utopia, a millennial kingdom, established after an apocalyptic battle fought against evil, either led by the Messiah or concluded by him. Now, many Jews prefer to talk about a messianic age rather than a Messiah, that is, a time when these things will occur without having recourse to a literal return. Using the example, for example, of Isaiah, that the lamb will lie down with a lion, and imagining that both of them will get a good night's sleep. Most Jews do not take these images literally. War, for example, is often an image for keeping the law. When you keep the law, you are fighting against evil and overcoming it. Now, the ultra-Orthodox and the Hasidim are more likely to take a literal view. In fact, the Orthodox believe that a literal Messiah will come sometime before the year 6000 on their calendar. Still plenty of time. In one strand of the tradition, two Messiahs will come. A Messiah of Joseph, who will fight evil but be defeated, followed by a Messiah of David, who will fight evil and win. One wonders if there's not some carryover or bleed over from Christian thinking about Jesus in that regard. Now, one complicating factor of the traditional view is that it includes the idea that as part of the basic plan of God in the last days, God will return the Jews to their land and reestablish their temple. That, of course, is a problem in the contemporary world, and we'll look at that problem and its political and religious dimensions next week. Little commercial. At the end, all nations will recognize the God of Israel, but not necessarily convert to Judaism. And Judaism is unique in that regard. At the end of the Messianic age, perhaps 400 years, the dead will be raised and judged, though, again, Jews in general are not so sure about heaven and hell as Christians and Muslims are. Now, when will Messiah come? The Jewish tradition is marvelously flexible, and here's a Talmudic passage that I think captures the spirit of the Jewish expectation of the end quite nicely. Yohanan said, "When you see a generation ever dwindling, hope for the Messiah, for it is written, 'The afflicted people you will save.'" He also said, "When you see a generation overwhelmed by many troubles, as by a river, await for the Messiah, for it is written, 'The enemy shall come like a flood. The Spirit of the Lord shall lift up a standard against him,' which is followed by, 'The Redeemer shall come to Zion.'" Rabbi Yohanan also said, "The Son of David will come only to a generation that is either altogether righteous or altogether wicked. And a generation is altogether righteous because it is written, 'The people shall be all righteous, and they shall inherit the land forever.' Or altogether wicked, as it is written, 'And he saw that there was no man, and wondered that there would be no intercessor.' And it is elsewhere written, 'For mine own sake, even for mine own sake, I will do it.'" In other words, it could happen anytime. It's going to happen when it happens. It's either going to be a good time or a bad time. Nobody really knows. There are other eschatological expectations in Judaism, the final prophet to return, and probably the one most common is Elijah. If you've ever been to a Passover Seder, you've seen the empty chair for Elijah, hoping that this year he will make his appearance. Now, Jewish conceptions of the Savior are thus somewhat flexible: teacher, prophet, warrior, priest. He'll focus on Israel, liberating the nation, clarifying the law, regathering the people. Of the several examples of messianic enthusiasm that I've come across, I'm going to talk about two, one military and one rhetorical. So, Jewish enactments of the end-time scenario. We've talked about the first Jewish revolt against Rome in the first century, when a group of zealots took control of Jerusalem, declared their independence, stopped paying taxes, stopped sacrificing for the emperor. The Roman response was predictable, quick, and devastating. They swooped down from the north, destroyed everything in their path, besieged Jerusalem for 3 years, starved it into submission, breached the walls, burned the temple, and left Jerusalem in ruins. It remained that way for some time, but in the early 2nd century, instead of working to begin rebuilding the temple as the emperor had promised, they began rebuilding the city as a Gentile city, as a Roman city. This led to rebellion, and unlike the earlier revolt, this one involved a messianic claimant. Jewish leaders rallied around a fellow named Simon Bar Kokhba. One of the leading rabbis of the time, Rabbi Akiva, renamed him Simon Bar Kokhba, which means son of the star, which is a messianic allusion to Numbers 24:7, that a star would arise in Israel. The immediate revolt was successful. They destroyed the first Roman legion sent against them to Rome's great shock. They established local rule, minted coins that proclaimed the era of righteousness and peace. But Rome struck back with force. Thousands were killed on both sides. The result was the expulsion of the Jews from not only the city, but Israel was now obliterated from the map, becoming a part of Syria, Palestine, so that Roman provinces were now without any mention of a land called Israel. The city was rebuilt, but it was rebuilt as Jupiter Capitolinus, and the temple rebuilt in it was a temple to Jupiter. The result of this messianic enactment thus was a complete loss of Jerusalem and 1,800 years of exile. This is the context for the saying of Yohanan ben Zakkai that we talked about earlier, where he said if someone comes and said, "Come quick, we found the Messiah," and while you're planting a tree, first plant the tree and then go look and see if it's the Messiah. And Jews have generally taken that approach. Let's first plant our trees and then we'll worry whether Messiahs come or not. There were occasional claimants, perhaps a couple of dozen in the next 1,900 years, mostly local, mostly short-lived. One, however, was an exception, a 17th century rabbi who was my second example. Unlike other claimants, Sabbatai Tzvi experienced both unimaginable success and utter failure. Born in Smyrna in Turkey in 1826, he had a strong mystical bent and alternating bouts of depression and manic activity as a young man. It was a time of widespread pogroms against the Jews, of persecution of Jewish communities, raids and devastation, and also a time of intense millennial expectation among Christians. Several of Harold Camping's forebears were predicting that the end of the world would come in 1666. Notice the 3 sixes. And by age 22, Sabbatai seems to have become learned in Talmud, but intensely mystical and deeply delusional. He started claiming to be the awaited Messiah. Apparently convinced by a strand of rabbinic teaching that the Messiah would inaugurate an era beyond the law, he began challenging the law. He began pronouncing the name of God, a thing forbidden, but known to occur in mystical visions. The leading rabbis of the day put him under the ban. He was eventually expelled from his native Smyrna, but he used the time to travel to major Jewish centers in Constantinople, Alexandria, Athens, and Jerusalem. Apparently was quite a charismatic young man, attracting converts, including some wealthy patrons, who supported his work in a most generous way. The story is complicated. The standard English work is by Gershom Scholem, The Mystical Messiah. His messianic claims became increasingly explicit and his actions increasingly erratic. For example, imitating the prophet Hosea, he married a prostitute in order to be a reincarnation, as it were, of the prophetic spirit. She turned out to be quite a business asset, and the two of them went run around and collected enormous sums of money. So that by 1666, now 40 years old, he was widely acclaimed with messianic titles, and even Christian scholars began to take note of him. Even leading rabbis began to accept his claims. The redemption of Israel seemed to be at hand. What could possibly go wrong? Well, at this point, the Sultan got involved. He invited him to Constantinople. Sabbatai went, perhaps expecting to be recognized as the Messiah, but instead was arrested. After months of confinement and various intrigues between various rival factions, the Sultan learned just what a Messiah claimed to be, namely the rightful ruler. And knowing that he himself was the rightful ruler, he confronted Sabbatai, and he did the most astonishing thing. He converted to Islam. Well, needless to say, this led to overwhelming disillusionment in the Jewish community, except many of his followers believed that this was somehow the right thing to do, and even 300 families converted to Islam along with him. Now, this strongly reinforced the reservations of many Jews about the end of days, though we'll see next week that such expectations can creep back in. Now, it's noteworthy that Sabbatai did not envision a war with the Ottoman Empire, though he did use the apocalyptic imagery of a lion devouring a 7-headed beast. So the Jewish attempt at second comings hasn't worked so well. How about the Christians? For Christians, the basic paradigm is this combination of parousia and martial expectations from the apocalypse, leading to the battle of Armageddon and final judgment. While all Christians believe in the second coming, many of them, especially the Orthodox, the Catholics, and liberal Protestants, tend to take it as symbolic or a liturgical reality rather than a literal event. Protestants, largely, and among the Protestants, mostly the evangelicals, believe it to be a second coming to be a literal event that's functional in their lives. Partly the Roman Church's distrustful of apocalyptic because the book of Revelation portrays Rome as the great beast. And in fact, maybe the whore that rides on the great beast, which has been handy for Protestants to use against Rome. And when Rome converted, that is when Constantine came along, this didn't work so well. And it was a problem and resulted in the marginalization of Revelation for some generations until Augustine solved the problem by imagining two cities, the city of God and the city of man, existing side by side, and that the city of God was being established on earth through the work of the church. In fact, in his view, the millennium, that is that period at the end of the book of Revelation when Christ would rule on earth for 1,000 years, the millennium was the life of the church as the church sought to enact God's will on earth. Now, Augustine never addressed how long 1,000 years was. Probably didn't seem relevant to him. It seemed like a very long time from now. But of course, a very long time from now has happened. And do you count the 1,000 years from the time of Jesus or from the time of Constantine? And different people began expecting the end of the world at different times. The most important thing that happened in that next period is around 1200, a priest monk by the name of Joachim of Fiora became obsessed with the mysteries of the Bible, especially the book of Revelation, and he proposed a whole new scheme of understanding history. The age of the Father, he said, was the period of the Old Testament. The age of the Son was the period of the church, that 1,000-year period, which now must be coming to an end. After all, it's 1200. And then the age of the Spirit, which was the new age of inwardness, marked by the spiritual monastic orders of the church. These theories resulted in stimulating apocalyptic speculation, and there was a great deal of people attempting to identify the coming end of the world, leading up to the Protestant Reformation, which was intensely apocalyptic and saw Rome as the great beast against whom they were working. Now there's much more, and some of which we'll look at next week, but this is sufficient for our purposes tonight, namely that the Protestant reinvigoration of the notion of Jesus' literal second coming has led to some claims about that. So Christian enactments of the end time scenarios. Now, Christ has already come in Christian view, so you wouldn't think that there would be a lot of other people claiming to be the Christ, but again, you'd be wrong. From Ann Lee and the Shakers to Sun Myung Moon and David Koresh in the 20th century, there have been numerous dozens, perhaps a couple dozen, claimants to be the second coming. Of the many examples of apocalyptic fervor between the Reformation and today, I will sketch one, perhaps paradigmatic, from the 19th century, and another less typical from the late 20th century. The most egregious example of failed apocalyptic expectation is the case of William Miller. He doesn't look crazy, does he? Miller lived in a time of social crisis just before the Civil War, which was on the horizon, great bank failures of the period, reform movement sweeping the country. He was a former Army leader and a conservative social critic, and thought all this change was leading to something, not to social change, but to the second coming of Jesus. And he thought he had developed a foolproof method of discovering the time of Jesus' return. Turns out there is no foolproof method, they're just different kinds of fools. Basing his calculations on a literal reading of Revelation and Daniel, especially 8:14, where Daniel gives the number of days before the end, he says the days are really years, he began to calculate that Christ would return to earth about 1843. Well, when nothing had happened by March of 1844, he went back to his calculator, admitting that he had made a mistake. He recalculated and predicted the exact date, October 22, 1844. What could go wrong? Perhaps 500,000 Americans awaited that fateful day with strong expectations, and as many as 50,000 sold or gave away their earthly possessions and quit their jobs and went to the countryside to await their transport to heaven. The date is known in Miller history as the Great Disappointment. Miller died discredited within a few years. And you would think his movement would fall apart, but it did not. It simply evolved into two contemporary denominations, the Seventh-day Adventists and the Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, I find it curious that the followers of both Sabbatai and Miller persisted beyond the clearest disconfirmation possible, persisted in their views. My second example comes from an offshoot of the Seventh-day Adventists, a group founded in the 1930s claiming to be the group through which God would set up the Davidic kingdom in Israel, so they took the name the Branch Davidians. The group's leader was a prophet who claimed that he was the interpreting angel of the book of Revelation. After a series of failed predictions, the movement split into several different factions, one of which wound up at Waco in Texas. It was to this group that Vernon Howell gravitated when he was excommunicated from the... That's Vernon. Excommunicated from the main Seventh-day Adventist denomination. Due to the force of his personality, his masterful interpretation of the book of Revelation, and some coercion, that is, he shot and wounded the other man who was competing for leadership, he established himself as the group's leader. He soon claimed the prophetic role of the founder, changed his name to David Koresh, both of being messianic claims, David for King David and Koresh for King Cyrus, whom Isaiah proclaimed to be the Messiah. He also claimed a divine mandate to raise up as many children as possible. He annulled the marriages of all the members of his community, claiming sexual possession of all the women and girls. He asserted control over all aspects of the members' lives, including what they ate, how they dressed, and what they did. He also began stockpiling guns, which brought the Waco compound to the attention of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. The Bureau raided the compound, resulting in a gun battle in which 4 agents and 6 civilians were killed, and thus began the 49-day siege that resulted in the death of 80 Davidians, including at least 20 children, in the Great Conflagration. Whether the fire was set accidentally or deliberately remains a matter of dispute. We see in these two examples of Miller and Koresh the enormous power of apocalyptic thinking to control human behavior. They also illustrate a tendency of end times thinking to divide the world into us and them. Both examples also elicit the curiosity and disparagement of outsiders who wonder at such certain but demonstrably false beliefs. Now, Islam does not envision the second coming of Muhammad. He completed his task. His job was to deliver the Quran to the people. He did that. It was, as they say, sent down. Now, the Quran's view of the end is straightforward, if a little surprising. God wills to produce a perfect, just, and prosperous world, a world in which His word prevails, hence a Muslim world. But the world is evil and increasingly chaotic. The hour of judgment is near at hand. The coming of the hour is unknown, but there are signs of it as it approaches. One of those signs will be the return of Jesus, who did not die. That's about how much you can get from the Quran. But this somewhat diffuse expectation has received considerable development in the Hadith, where 2 critical figures were introduced, the Dajjal and the Mahdi. The Dajjal represents the human embodiment of evil, roughly equivalent to the Christian Antichrist. Since the Muslim idea of the devil, whom they call Iblis, was only of a tempter who had no power over people, it's not clear that he could rule the world. And so instead of that, they imagine, as Christians do, that the power of Satan will be transferred to some human agent who will appear good, but will really be Satan in disguise, as it were, and he will attempt to rule the world and destroy God's people. Now, God will meet this crisis by sending Jesus back into the world. Jesus will descend at Damascus, according to one tradition, attack and kill the Dajjal, overcome the demonic hordes of Ya'juj and Ma'juj, also called Gog and Magog in other traditions, and embrace Islam. Jesus will then rule the earth for 40 years. Other traditions say he'll appear at Jerusalem and perhaps rule for only 7 or 9 years. The Shias developed this scenario further with the notion of the mystical Mahdi, who is not dead but only hidden in the divine world, from which he will return to guide the faithful at the end of days. One scenario is that after Jesus returns and kills the Dajjal and completes his reign, he will die, after which the Mahdi will return and lead the Muslim army to victory over the nations. Alternatively, the Mahdi may emerge in opposition to the Dajjal, that is, they both emerge at the same time as his righteous opponent, and God will send Jesus then to help the Mahdi in the final battle. The Mahdi will then rule perhaps for 12 generations, but in a world not unlike the one we live in. Unlike Judaism and Christianity, Islam does not posit a millennial kingdom of 2 ages, but a continuation of this world in a refined form. Now, none of this is found in the Quran, this last part, but it's been justified by the Hadith literature, literally thousands of them, and is not accepted by all Muslims. Many Sunnis reject the Mahdi tradition, and some reject the Dajjal tradition. It is this lack of uniform tradition of the Mahdi that has produced claims of apocalyptic authority in Islam. There have been at least 16 men who've claimed to be the Mahdi, and perhaps another dozen whose followers have made that claim for them. We will look at 2. So Islamic enactments of the end time. Get him off there. Like Judaism and Christianity, Islam has been wary of end-time scenarios, especially the Sunnis, who tend to support the status quo. But minority movements in Islam have been intensely apocalyptic, especially got a quick thumb, especially the Shias, the Salafi, and the Sufis, a mystical type of Islam emphasizing spiritual discipline. And that discipline can be from prayer and meditation all the way to dancing, things ordinary Muslims would find not acceptable. These movements tend to be puritanical, anti-modernist, and to see themselves as the true Islam. Various Sufi sheikhs have claimed to have special powers. Some even have claimed to be the Mahdi. For example, a late 19th century figure known as the Mahdi of the Sudan, Muhammad Ahmad ibn Abdullah, rejected the formal Islam of the Madrasa for Sufi mysticism. He followed a mystic teacher who claimed to be a manifestation of the Mahdi, not to be the Mahdi, but to be a manifestation of him, a somewhat softer messianic claim. Muhammad, however, went further. He eventually changed his name to Muhammad al-Mahdi, living at the beginning of the new Islamic century, that is, it was the year 1300 AH, 1883 on the common calendar. He saw his mission as purifying and reinvigorating Islam, and he did this by imitating the life of Muhammad. That is, he withdrew to a safe area, he attacked his opponents to try to bring them into submission, and because of this, living this myth, as it were, he was able to exert enormous influence on his followers and replicated Muhammad's feat by defeating the British force that was aiding Egypt, who then ruled Sudan. And he died just a couple years later, but they maintained the rule of Islam for about 13 years when the British retook it in 1898. But he had demonstrated the power of end times ideas to affect political change, something we'll look at more in detail next week when we look at Iran. He had also reinforced the distrust of apocalyptic among mainstream Sunnis. Due in part to the Mahdi of the Sudan, Carroll University and the Muslim Brotherhood have downplayed Islam's apocalyptic aspect. Our other example demonstrates a strong tendency among apocalyptic movements in Islam to be anti-Western, anti-Jewish, and anti-Muslim establishment. Like Qumran, the Essenes of Qumran, they do not see other members of their sect as their real brothers, that they are lost to them. On the first day of the next century, the 15th century in Islam, 1400 AH, or 20 September 1979, hard on the heels of the Iranian Revolution, a group of 300 or so armed men took control of the Kaaba in Mecca, just as hundreds of thousands of Muslims had come on pilgrimage. More shocking still, one of the group ascended the tower near the Station of Abraham and proclaimed that he was the awaited Mahdi. The leader of this group was Juhayman al-Utabi, former National Guard, and politically active. His family had played a key role in the establishment of the Saudi royal family in the early 20th century, but his grandfather had led an unsuccessful revolt against the Sauds in 1929. When the National Guard was demobilized in 73, Utabi went to Medina and became active in what is described as a, quote, puritanical and sectarian group of young unmarried men. He soon rose to leadership and renamed the group the Ikhwan, the Brothers, the same name as the group his grandfather had led in rebellion. This, of course, attracted the attention of the security forces, but he was well connected and he moved a lot. He began to publish tracts on the corruption of the House of Saud and its suspension of jihad, including its cozy relationship with the United States, the protector of Israel, he began to interpret the history of the Arabian Peninsula in explicitly apocalyptic terms. The Ikhwan was God's agent for the end-time transformation. He concluded that the Mahdi was to be revealed in the Kaaba, and when he announced that the Mahdi was none other than his own brother-in-law, a direct descendant of the Prophet, many abandoned the group. But those who remained were true believers. Believing the Mahdi had appeared, knowing the Saud family was not well liked, he decided on a confrontation. What could possibly go wrong? Arms were secured in Yemen and smuggled into the Kaaba. When the rebellion began, they expected a widespread revolt to ensue, but the populace did not follow. Not because they loved the Sauds, but because they could not get over the sacrilege of violating the Kaaba. The king obtained a fatwa authorizing the use of force to retake the Kaaba. The initial attacks were easily repelled by the well-armed and well-positioned rebels. With the use of plans from Salim bin Laden, whose family had constructed the buildings, and an elaborate battle plan using tear gas, French commandos, who were, of course, first converted to Islam so they could enter the Kaaba, and strategic explosives, the Kaaba was retaken after 2 weeks and hundreds of casualties. The bin Ladens cooperated, but one of the brothers, Osama bin Laden, refused to condemn the rebels, who were mainly Saudis, but included a number of foreigners. The Mahdi apparently died early in the siege, but Utabi and 62 of his followers were captured and condemned to death, publicly decapitated in 8 cities in January 9, 1980. And of course, rumors persist that the Mahdi did not really die. He just returned to his state of spiritual occultation, ready for the next revolution. Well, what are we to make of all these failures? First, I think they remind us of human gullibility. There is a percentage of our fellow citizens who can convince themselves that a Nigerian businessman has died and left them hundreds of thousands of dollars, and that notice of that will arrive by an anonymous email. Surely it's a small percentage, but the number seems to go up substantially when you clothe the idea in religious garb. I think we would do well to heed the advice of Yohanan ben Zakkai, finish planting our trees before we wander off to see a Messiah. Second, these stories help us avoid the idea that one of these traditions is inherently superior to the others. All too often we want to compare the best of our tradition with the worst of other traditions. Gullibility is apparently non-denominational. In the same vein, we can perhaps appreciate that these are minority movements in all 3 traditions. Third, the story suggests that end times thinking has a tremendous dynamism, power to organize a community effort, and perhaps effect real change. Of course, the change may be for good or for ill. Fourth and finally, millennial aspirations remind us of the need to see the needs of the dispossessed who find the vision of a time when the roles are reversed, when the first shall be last and the last shall be first, is an attractive idea to them. Apocalyptic dream has enormous power for change, power for reform, power for disaster. Now, religions generally support the status quo. The clearest example of this is the caste system in India, where you get what you deserve, if not what you deserve in this life, what you deserve from some previous life. It's automatic. Carried over somewhat in medieval thinking, I once learned a little poem that went something like this. The Lord is in his castle, the beggar at his gate. The Lord above, he made them both and ordered their estate. That is, the notion that the world that we habit is the divinely established world is a common function of religion. And one thing you can say about apocalyptic thinking, it's not establishment thinking. While maintaining a healthy skepticism toward those who claim the second coming is at hand, we can recognize its power to challenge the status quo, which very often needs to be challenged. Well, next week we're going to focus on contemporary movements, attempt to harness this power of end times thinking for political purposes, and try to do something more contemporary. So that's the end of the talk tonight, but I await your questions. I'll take up drinking while you wait. Someone ask a question so the students can feel they've stayed for questions, then get up and leave. I'm obviously a skeptic. I I don't find any of these explanations convincing. I find them only mildly amusing. And if I offend you in that regard, I can apologize for the offense, but not for my opinion. No? Nothing? Nothing? Yes. Get us started.
Your remark about the gullibility issue. It seems to me that gullibility is not confined to people with religious disposition.
I agree.
What do you think is peculiar about, and people believe all kinds of nonsense. What do you think is peculiar about folks of religious sensibility? Or is there something?
I think there is something unique about religion in that it is the most fundamental framework from which one operates. And when something touches on that framework, it has more power than if it just has to do with your finances, say, or with your family, or with things that are less central to one's concept of who they are as a person. I think it gains its power because of the tremendous power that religion has to shape human imagination. I'll keep my answers short if you keep the questions coming. Otherwise, I'll have to get long. No? 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 Going once? Going twice? Sold.
How would you characterize the group generally that you consider the non-credulous of today?
The groups within these traditions?
No, just in general. So that there's a group that's not gullible, and then there's this group that is gullible.
Mostly the Scots. A lot of Scottish heritage myself. I think we're all gullible about different things. When it's something you want to believe, you tend to be more gullible about it than if it's somebody else's idea. And so what I find in these examples is the extreme belief. You go out and quit your job and give your possessions away, probably tell your boss what you thought of him before you left, and then have to come back the next day. And the persistence of the believers and the communities after the failure of the prediction to come true. That is, it's demonstrably wrong, and yet people continue to follow. I find that a level of credulity that I can't muster. Yes?
Well, has anybody proposed a psychological theory? Is there a certain kind of personality or something like that that's more prone to this sort of thing? You know, the status anxiety thing?
I don't know of any.
Some sort of sociological or psychological theory.
There are some sociological theories of deprivation looking for compensation, as it were, that tend to make people, as they say, people cleaning up behind the cow want it to turn around, and they get on the productive end. But none of that has been scientifically demonstrated. The best study I know of is of a new religious movement that emerged called the cargo cults, which the natives imagined the coming of the ships bringing cargo would one day come and bring the cargo for them, and started a revolutionary movement on that basis. So there is some connection between sociological disadvantage and one's willingness to believe in radical transformation of the world. It's not an automatic transference, I think. Yes?
How do you relate this to the Christians in the 1st and 2nd century? Do they fit into this same scenario that you're talking about?
Which scenario do you mean? They believed in the second coming. Is that they did?
They sold everything to a common group. They believed the second coming was within their lifetimes.
Some did.
Yet they persisted after they realized that wasn't happening. I mean, everything you seem to be saying seems to apply to early Christianity.
I would have to agree. And it happened again in the 2nd century. It was a new outburst of, it's called Montanism, of enthusiastic fever about the coming end of the world, where Jesus would come to Asia Minor, not to Jerusalem. But, and that was had a tremendous impact on early 2nd century believers as well. The difference, I think, is that when you name a specific day, it's disconfirmed. If you just say it's going to happen soon, that was the first cartoon I started out with. All the dates scratched off and said the end is 1988, 1995. Soon. If you say soon, you can never disconfirm that. Hal Lindsey made the mistake in his first book, first edition of The Late Great Planet Earth, to predict that the world would end in 1988, never imagining his book would go through many editions and still be in print in 1988, where he said it will happen sometime around 1988, or in the near future, or eventually soon. One last question? I hear a voice, but I see no one. Yes, I'm sorry.
Within Catholicism, have any of the religious authorities, any of the popes, commented on the end of the world, or had any insights or theories?
Interesting question, to which I do not know the answer. Any good Catholic theologians in our midst? That's not an oxymoron? Where's Edwin when I need him? I can tell you that in general the Catholic Church takes these things as symbolic and liturgical, and follows Augustine in his notion that the New Jerusalem descends from heaven anytime anyone joins the church. That is the creation of the New Jerusalem. So they tend to be more symbolical and liturgical in their interpretation, and not. I do not know of any Catholics who named a date and propounded the end of the world of that. There may be one, but I have not come across it.
Wasn't there some kind of thing with that letter from the Fatima children, that the Pope supposedly had the information?
Anybody know the answer to that?
Secret. It's a secret.
National security.
We could tell you, but then we'd have to kill you.
Then I shall be happy with my ignorance, which I hope I've demonstrated already. Thank you for your coming. We've got one more week on the politics of the end time.